Snow drove sideways across a nameless ridge in the sawtooth high country, swallowing the last gray light of a dying afternoon. A woman on her hands and knees crawled through the drifts, her wool coat stiff with ice, dragging herself toward a hard, straight line that did not belong among the trees. It was the roofline of a cabin no living soul had touched in 24 winters, its chimney cold, its door rusted shut against the decades. Inside, her frozen fingers reached up into the black throat of that chimney, hunting a jam damper, and brushed instead against something wrapped in cloth. A heavy steel box tore loose and crashed into the dying fire, and when she pried it open, the firelight fell on bundles of old red-sealed and 4 bars of dull gold. Beneath the fortune lay a sealed letter, its ink pressed hard into brittle paper, addressed to a woman named Marguerite Ellery. But as she read a dead man's confession of a sheriff's forged deeds and stolen land, the storm outside shifted its voice. Through the walls came the slow, deliberate crunch of a horse being ridden straight toward the cabin. The wind came off the high country like something with a grievance, driving needles of ice sideways into a face that had no business being out in it. Adelia Voss had lived 34 winters, most of them in places where cold was an inconvenience rather than a verdict, and she understood now, with the slow horror of a person arriving late to her own peril, that the mountains did not care what she had survived before. The storm had a voice, low and constant, and beneath its howl ran a quieter sound that frightened her more. The sound of her own breath growing shallow, her own thoughts turning soft at the edges. She had set out that morning from the rail camp at the foot of the Sawtooth Range, with a satchel of charcoals, a folio of paper stiffened against the damp, and instructions from the surveying office to sketch the last unmapped mile of the proposed line before the season closed it off entirely. The men who ran the survey had wanted a woman's eye, they said, someone who could render a slope in a way that made investors back east believe iron rails belonged there. She had done the work for 3 seasons up and down the territory, and she had earned a name for it, the quiet illustrator who never complained about the mud or the mules or the long hours in the saddle. She had earned, too, a false confidence, the kind that grows in a person who has walked to the edge of danger many times and always walked back. The weather had lied to her, or she had lied to herself about the weather. A drover at the camp had squinted at the sky at dawn and said it smelled like snow, and she had thanked him and gone anyway because the light was good. The line was waiting, and she had never yet let a gray morning stop her. By midday, the sky above the ridge had curdled into a bruised and swollen thing, purple at its heart, and the first flakes had come down fat and lazy, almost pretty, the kind of snow that makes a person smile before it makes her afraid. She had turned the buckboard back toward camp then, not panicked, only prudent, and she had gotten perhaps 2 miles down the rutted trace before the front axle found a hole the snow had hidden and cracked clean through with a sound like a rifle shot. The horse, a nervous roan she had never fully trusted, reared against the sudden lurch and tore the traces from her hands. And before she could gather the lines, it bolted into the white, its hoofbeats swallowed within seconds. She stood beside the ruined wagon with the leather burning across her palms, and she understood in a cold, flat way that she was now a woman alone on a mountain that meant to kill her, with the daylight already thinning and the temperature falling like a stone down a well. For a while, she sheltered in the lee of the overturned buckboard, huddled in her wool coat, with the folio pressed uselessly to her chest, telling herself that someone would come. No one came. The trace she had traveled ran nowhere anyone would travel in a storm like this, and the camp would not miss her until nightfall. And by nightfall, she would be past missing. She made the decision to walk the way she thought she had come, back toward the low ground, where the timber grew thick enough to break the wind, because to stay was to freeze against the boards of a wagon that had already failed her once. Before she left it, she did one thing that would matter more than she could know, sliding the folio and the small oilcloth packet of matches deep into the satchel and cinching it hard across her body, because a woman who works with her hands learns early that the tools are the last thing to abandon. The snow was to her knees within the first quarter mile. Each step became a negotiation, a lifting and dragging and planting that her legs performed with less and less conviction. She kept her head down and her collar high, and she counted her steps because counting gave her mind something to hold that was not the cold. The cold had gotten into her boots. It had worked into the seams of her coat and the roots of her hair, and it moved through her now not as a sensation, but as a slow subtraction, taking her fingers first, then the feeling in her cheeks, then, most treacherous of all, her fear. That was the thing the drover had never warned her about. The thing no one warned about, because those who learned it rarely came back to tell it. The cold, past a certain point, stopped hurting. It began instead to comfort. Somewhere in the second mile, when she had lost the trace entirely and the world had narrowed to a churning gray funnel with herself at the bottom of it, she found that she was no longer afraid, and she understood dimly that this was the worst sign of all. A warmth had begun to spread through her chest, false and seductive, whispering that she might sit down for just a moment, only a moment, to rest her legs and close her stinging eyes. She saw lights then, warm and golden, flickering through the trees to her left, and her heart lifted with a joy so pure it nearly undid her. She turned toward them and stumbled forward with the last coherent strength in her body, and it was only when she had gone 30 yards that the lights resolved into nothing. Only the pale disk of a hidden moon catching on a curtain of falling snow. There was no cabin. There was no fire. There was only the white and the cold and her own mind, offering her beautiful lies to ease her passage out of the world. Her legs went out from under her over a root buried in the drift, and she fell face first into the snow, and she did not want to rise. The snow was soft. It cradled her. She lay with her cheek against it and thought, with the strange lucid calm of the freezing, that this was not such a terrible way to go, that she had done good work and hurt no one. And there were worse endings than sleep. Her eyes drifted closed. The wind hushed for a moment, a lull in the storm's long argument with itself, and in that sudden pocket of stillness, some animal part of her, some stubborn ancient thing that refused the peace her mind had made, forced her head to turn one final degree. 50 yards on, half swallowed by snow-laden pines, there was an angle in the tree line that did not belong to any tree. A hard straight line, a pitch, a roof. The sight of it struck through her like a current, and whatever reserve the body keeps for the last moment before surrender flooded her limbs. She could not stand, so she crawled. She dragged herself through the powder on her forearms and her knees, hauling her dead legs behind her, keeping that improbable straight line fixed in her wavering vision, because to lose it was to lose everything. The shape grew as she neared it, resolving from a suggestion into a certainty. A small cabin of squared timber, black with age, and sagging on its western side like an old man leaning into a long wind. Snow had drifted to the sills. No smoke rose from the stone chimney at its far end. No track marred the white around it. Whatever this place was, no living soul had passed here in a very long time. She reached the porch, and the rotten boards groaned beneath her weight as she pulled herself upright against a post. The door was oak, heavy, and it did not move when she threw her shoulder against it once, twice, the third time with a sob of effort torn out of her. A padlock, rusted into its hasp, held it shut against her and against the decades. She would not get through it. Her strength was nearly gone, and the door would outlast her. To the right of the door was a small window, its four panes grimed opaque with age. She did not stop to think. She wrapped her coat sleeve over her frozen hand, took up a length of split firewood that lay half buried on the porch, and swung it into the glass. The pane shattered inward with a sound shockingly loud in that muffled world. A bright, violent crack that seemed to travel out across the whole silent valley. She reached through the jagged mouth of it, careful even in her desperation, found the simple latch, and worked it free. Then she hauled herself up and over the sill and fell into the dark interior in a heap, gasping, shaking, alive. The change was immediate, and it saved her. The wind, which had been a living hand pressing against her for hours, simply stopped. Inside the cabin, the air was still and bitterly cold, but it was still, and the difference between wind and no wind was the difference between dying and not. She lay on the plank floor amid the broken glass and let the sound of her own ragged breathing fill the room. Feeling began to return to her extremities, and it returned as agony, a deep burning throb in her fingers and toes as the blood fought its way back into ground it had abandoned. She welcomed the pain. Pain meant the flesh was not yet lost. When at last she could make her hands obey her, she drew out the oilcloth packet with its matches and a stub of tallow candle, saved against exactly this kind of hour. Her fingers were clumsy sticks, and it took 4 failed strikes before the 5th caught, and the little light bloomed and pushed the darkness back into the corners of the room. What it revealed made her go still, despite her shivering. The cabin had been left, not fled from but left, closed up and walked away from, then simply forgotten by the world for the better part of a lifetime. Dust lay over everything in a soft gray fur, undisturbed so thick in places it had rounded the hard edges of things. Against one wall stood an iron bedstead, its ticking mattress gnawed and gray with rot. A plank table sat at the room's center with 2 chairs drawn up to it, and on the table stood a tin coffee pot and a single enameled cup, set down as if their owner meant to return before the coffee cooled. A wardrobe of dark wood stood against the far wall with its doors ajar, showing a row of empty hangers within. It was a room holding its breath, waiting for someone who was never coming home. She had no attention to spare for its melancholy. Her candle would not last. Her body was still perilously cold, and her wet clothes were pulling the warmth from her core with every passing minute. Along the entire eastern wall ran a great fireplace built of rounded river stone, wide and deep, its mortar dark with the soot of long-dead fires. Warmth. Everything now depended on warmth, and she had perhaps a quarter of an hour before the cold that had followed her indoors finished the work the mountain had begun. She limped to the nearest chair, set her boot against its seat, and bore down, and the brittle wood gave way with a crack. The legs and back, splintering into a rough kindling she gathered against her chest. From the chinks between the wall logs she pulled fistfuls of old newspaper that some long ago hand had stuffed there against the drafts, yellowed and dry as autumn leaves. She glanced at them by candlelight as she crumpled them, and the dates caught her eye. The summer of 1863, a year that felt impossibly distant, a year when this room had perhaps still known a living voice. She knelt on the cold stone of the hearth and built her small architecture of paper and shattered wood with hands that would barely close. She touched the candle flame to the paper. It caught at once, flaring bright, and for one blessed instant she felt the promise of heat against her face, and something in her chest that had been clenched for hours began to loosen. Then the smoke came. It did not rise. It rolled out of the firebox and into the room in a thick, acrid billow, stinging her eyes, filling her throat, sending her back onto her heels in a fit of coughing that shook her whole, exhausted frame. The chimney would not draw. The flue, she realized through streaming eyes, the damper, closed for a quarter century against the weather and rusted into place. If she could not open it, she would have to smother the only fire she had the strength to build. And she did not think she had the strength to build another. She snatched a slender length of chair leg from her pile and thrust it up into the black throat of the chimney, feeling blindly for the iron lever that would free the damper. The stick scraped against cold metal. She pushed at it, threw her weight against it, and the mechanism did not so much as shudder. It had seized solid, rust welded to rust across 24 winters. She dropped the stick with a curse. She would not have spoken in front of any living person, wrapped her sleeve once more around her hand, and forced her bare arm straight up into the filthy dark, soot raining down onto her upturned face, her fingers walking across the rough iron plate in search of the catch. She found the edge of the damper. She traced along it, hunting the lever, and her fingertips brushed something that had no business being there. It was not iron, and it was not stone. It was cloth, or something wrapped in cloth, and it sat on a narrow ledge of masonry a little way up the shaft, tucked back behind the plate where no eye would ever find it, and no hand would ever reach it by accident. A strap of some kind, thick and stiff with age, ran across the front of it. She hooked 2 fingers under the strap and pulled, and the thing did not move, held fast by its own weight and the grip of the years. She braced her boots against the hearthstones, took the strap in both hands, and hauled with a strength she had not known remained to her. And, with a long, grinding scrape of metal against stone, the object tore free of its hiding place. It came down the shaft heavily, struck the iron grate with a clang that rang through the small room, and landed square in the middle of her struggling fire, crushing it flat and scattering embers across the hearth. She scrambled backward from the sudden shower of sparks, coughing, and stared at the thing that had fallen out of the chimney, as though the mountain itself had reached down and handed it to her. She dragged it clear of the coals with the same stick she had dropped, rolling it out onto the cold stone before the wrapping could catch. The smoke was already thinning, drawing out now through the broken window, and, she realized, up the chimney, for in dislodging the bundle she had knocked the seized damper loose from its bed of rust, and the flue was drawing at last. She fed the newspaper and kindling back into the firebox and coaxed the scattered embers into a flame. And this time the fire took and held and climbed, and a first true wave of heat rolled out into the room and touched her frozen face like a benediction. She was going to live. The knowledge came to her plainly, without drama, and she let herself sit with it a moment before her eyes went back to the thing on the hearth. It was a strong box of heavy steel, about the size of a large family Bible, wrapped in a dense fibrous cloth, gone black and brittle along its exposed edges, but which had shielded the metal within from the smoke of every fire built beneath it. The strap she had pulled was riveted to the wrapping, a handle deliberately made, meant for the hand of someone who knew exactly where the box was hidden, and meant one day to retrieve it. She sat back on her heels and looked at it, and the illustrator's mind that never quite stopped working turned the fact over and found it strange past all reckoning. A person did not wrap a steel box in fireproof cloth and wedge it up a chimney in the wilderness for want of a better cupboard. A person did that to keep a thing hidden from someone who was hunting it very hard. She did not open it that night. This was the first choice that would later seem to her the hallmark of a sane mind, made in an hour when sanity was a fragile and flickering thing. Her hands were shaking, her judgment blurred, her whole body clenched around the single animal imperative of getting warm. And the box, whatever it held, had waited 24 years and could wait until morning. She stripped off her sodden coat and hung it near the fire, pulled the least rotted blanket from the foot of the iron bed and wrapped herself in it, and huddled close to the growing flames, with the strongbox sitting, silent, at her side like a companion that had not yet decided whether to speak. She ate the heel of bread and the strip of dried beef from her satchel. She let the heat sink into her bones, and somewhere in the long dark hours, lulled by the fire's murmur and the storm's diminishing complaint against the walls, she slept. She woke to a gray light seeping through the grimed glass and the broken pane, and to a cold that had lost its edge. The storm outside spent to a thin, steady fall of ordinary snow. Her fingers ached, but they answered her. The fire had burned down to a bed of orange coals, and she fed it before she did anything else, watching the flames climb, before she turned to the box. It had a hasp secured by a padlock of tarnished brass, and the padlock would not yield to her fingers. She rose stiffly, searched the cabin, and found in a rusted toolbox beneath the sagging counter along the north wall a short iron pry bar, furred with rust but sound. She carried it back to the hearth and sat cross-legged before the fire with the box in her lap and worked the curved end of the bar beneath the padlock's shackle. She set her weight against it. The old brass resisted, held, then broke with a sharp, bright snap that startled her in the quiet room. She drew the ruined lock away and let it fall to the stone, and she lifted the lid, and the hinges shrieked in protest at a movement they had not made in nearly a quarter of a century. A breath of stale air rose from the interior, the smell of old paper and leather and enclosed dark. The box was full. Lying across the top was a bundle of banknotes, and beneath it more bundles, the paper large and crisp in a way she had never handled, bound with rubber that had perished long ago and crumbled to dust at her touch. She lifted a single note to the firelight. It was $100 bill, but its face was strange to her. The engraving ornate, the seal a deep red, rather than the color she knew. The design belonging to a vanished decade. She counted the first bundle and found it held $10,000. And beneath it lay five more, just the same, $60,000, in old notes that no one had spent, no one had claimed, or no one had touched, since the year those newspapers were fresh. The money did not frighten her. What lay beneath it did. Under the last bundle, nested in the bottom of the box, were 4 bars of dull yellow metal, each about the length of her hand, each stamped with a serial number and a crude assayer's mark. She lifted one, and its weight dragged her wrist down. It was far heavier than its size promised. Heavy in the particular dense way that only one metal is heavy. Gold. 4 bars of it, easily 20 pounds together, worth on their own a sum that made the paper fortune beneath them seem almost an afterthought. She set the bar down carefully, as though it might wake something, and she stared into the box, and her breath fogged in the cold air above it. "What are you?" she said aloud, and the sound of her own voice in that dead room startled her nearly as much as the gold had. She had not meant to speak. The silence had drawn it out of her. There was more. Beneath where the gold had lain, resting on a folded square of velvet, gone stiff with age, sat a small journal bound in cracked leather, and, beside it, a thick envelope of heavy paper sealed with a disk of dark wax. She wiped her soot-stained hands against her skirt, an instinct toward reverence, and lifted the envelope first. The paper was brittle at its edges, foxed brown with time, and across its face, in an elegant looping hand that had pressed hard enough to score the paper, 3 words had been written. For Marguerite Ellery. She held the envelope a long moment without opening it. There was a threshold in it she could feel without being able to name. A sense that to break the wax was to step out of her own life and into someone else's, into whatever grief or fear or love had driven a person to hide a fortune, up a chimney, and seal a letter and never return for either. She was cold, and she was hungry, and she was alive when hours ago she had been nearly dead. And the sensible thing was to leave the dead their secrets and think only of her own survival until rescue came. But the illustrator in her, the woman whose whole living was made of looking closely at things others passed by, could not leave it. She worked her thumb beneath the wax and broke the seal. Inside were several sheets folded together, covered in the same strong looping hand. She unfolded the topmost, leaned toward the fire, and began to read. And the cold room and the falling snow and her own precarious circumstances fell away from her entirely. The date at the head of the letter was the 9th of November, 1863. "My dearest Marguerite," it began, "if this letter has come into your hands, then I never reached the valley, and it means that he found me after all." She read on, and the story assembled itself before her in the dead man's careful script. He had written it to a woman he loved, a woman he had promised to marry, a woman from whom he had been driven by circumstances. The letter laid out in a cold and deliberate hand. He had told her once, he wrote, that the money from their family's partnership had been lost, swallowed up in the confusion that followed his father's death. That had been a lie, and he begged her forgiveness for he had told it to keep her safe. The money had not been lost. It had been stolen, and he had stolen it back. The man who had taken it had not been a banker or a business rival. He had been the law. Sheriff Josiah Harker had used the authority of his office and the trust of the county to forge a foreclosure against the Thorncroft family land. And the writer's own name stood plain at the letter's close. Elias Thorncroft, a grieving son, the law had counted on being too broken to fight. Harker had drawn up false papers, timed the theft to the vulnerable weeks after old Thorncroft's death, and reckoned that a man with a badge and the whole machinery of the county behind him could take whatever he pleased. He had reckoned wrong. Elias had not fought him in the courts, where the courts belonged to Harker. He had gone instead, on a night that November, into the sheriff's own strong room, and he had taken back what had been stolen, and more besides, and he had taken one thing Harker would miss far more than the gold. The journal, the letter said, the small leather book that lay even now in the bottom of the box. It held everything. Every bribe Josiah Harker had paid and taken, Every false deed he had filed, every parcel of land he had seized from families too weak, or too grieving, or too frightened to resist. All of it recorded in the sheriff's own careful hand across a decade of quiet theft. It was, Elias wrote, enough to put the man behind bars for the rest of his natural life. And Adelia understood as she read it that the writer had known exactly what he held, and had known exactly what it would cost him. For Harker had seen him. As Elias slipped from the strong room in the dark, the sheriff had come upon him, and their eyes had met, and after that there was no going back and no going home. He had run, the letter said, for 2 days and 2 nights, up into the high country with the snow, beginning to fall and cover his tracks. But the sheriff had dogs, and the sheriff had men, and the sheriff had the whole authority of the county to lend his pursuit the color of justice. Do not trust the law in that county, Elias had written, the words pressed hard into the page. Do not trust any man who wears a badge there. Take the book to the federal marshals, and take it far, and let them be the ones to bring him down. There was tenderness in the letter, too, threaded through the fear, and it was the tenderness that undid her. He wrote of the valley they had meant to reach together, of the life they had planned, of a promise made under some summer tree in a season now buried under snow. He wrote that he was very cold, that the fire he dared not light, for fear of the smoke, had left him nothing but the thought of her to warm him, and that the thought was enough. He wrote that if he did not come, she was to know he had not stopped, not for 1 hour of those 2 days, that he had carried her name up the mountain with him, like a coal held cupped against the wind. I have loved you every step of this cold country, the last lines read, and I will love you at the end of it, whatever the end proves to be. Keep yourself safe. Burn nothing I have written until Harker is in chains. And know that a man can be robbed of everything he owns and still die rich, if he has once been loved the way you have loved me. Adelia lowered the letter. The fire snapped and settled. The snow fell past the broken window in a slow gray curtain. For a long while she did not move, sitting with the pages loose in her lap and the weight of a stranger's last hours settling over her like a second cold. Elias Thorncroft had never reached the valley. She knew it with a certainty that needed no proof. For the box was still here, and if he had lived, he would have come back for it. Come back for the letter meant for the woman he loved. Come back to lay the journal before the marshals and see Josiah Harker answer for what he had done. He had done none of these things. He had hidden his fortune and his evidence up a chimney against the day of his return, and that day had never come. And the mountain that had nearly killed her had killed him somewhere in this same white country. 24 winters gone, whether by the cold or by the men and dogs that hunted him, she would never know. And Josiah Harker had never found the box. That thought arrived with a slow and dawning weight, for she knew the name Harker. Anyone who had spent a season in the territory knew the name Harker. The Harkers held paper on half the county, owned the mercantile blocks in 3 towns, sat on the boards of the bank and the freight company, and the very railroad whose line she had come here to draw. Josiah Harker had not remained a county sheriff. He had built, on the foundation of his stolen land, one of the great fortunes of the territory, and he had died a few years past an honored man, a pillar, a name spoken with respect in every parlor from the capital to the border. She had heard that name spoken so, and now she sat in a dead man's cabin with the proof that all of it, every acre and every dollar and every honored word, had been built on forgery and theft, and that a man had died in the snow to keep the proof alive. She lifted the journal from the box with hands that had begun, faintly, to tremble again, and it was not the cold that moved them now. She turned the stiff pages and found them exactly as the letter had promised, dense, with a cramped and careful hand. Columns of names and dates and figures, a decade of quiet larceny set down by the thief himself, as though he had never once imagined it could be turned against him. She recognized some of the names. Families still in the territory, land still in dispute. At the front of the book, in that same hand, stood an inscription of ownership, the name Josiah Harker written plain, as if the man had wanted, even in his private ledger of sins, to be sure his property was known to be his. The grandson. The thought came to her unbidden and turned her cold in a way the fire could not touch. Josiah Harker was dead, but the Harkers were not, and she remembered now. From a newspaper she had read only weeks before in the surveying office that Cornelius Harker, grandson of the old sheriff, heir to the whole vast fortune, was that very winter mounting a campaign for the governorship of the territory. The papers had called him a man of vision, a builder, a native son, who would carry the territory into statehood. His campaign was funded, they said, by the Harker interests, by the land and the banks and the railroad, by every asset the family had accumulated across 3 generations of careful stewardship, by theft, by the contents of the book in her hands. She was holding the ruin of the most powerful family in the territory. She was holding the thing they had spent a fortune and a lifetime believing was lost. The thing old Josiah must have hunted through these mountains in the years before he died, sending men into this same wild country to find the cabin and the box and burn them both before the world could learn what he was. He had never found it. His heir had never found it, and now it lay open in the lap of a stranded illustrator with soot on her hands and a dead man's love letter beside her knee, and the knowledge of what she held pressed down on her with a weight she had not felt, even when she lay dying in the drifts. The wind shifted outside. She noticed it only because the pitch of the storm's voice changed, dropping from a howl to a lower register, and in the space that change opened up, she heard a sound that stopped her breath in her throat. It was faint, muffled by the walls and the falling snow, but it was unmistakable, and it did not belong to the wind or the mountain or anything wild. It was the rhythmic, muffled crunch of hooves breaking through crust, slow and deliberate, and drawing nearer. The sound of a horse being ridden with care up the same buried slope she had crawled the night before. Someone was coming to the cabin. Someone who knew, in all that trackless white, exactly where the cabin stood. She moved before she had finished thinking. She swept the letter and the journal together and pushed them deep into the satchel at her hip, and she took up the box in both arms and looked wildly around the small room for anywhere to put a thing that size. The bed. She crossed to the iron bedstead, dropped to her knees, and shoved the strong box deep beneath it, back against the wall where the shadows lay thickest, then dragged a fallen length of rotted canvas over it and kicked a drift of dust and debris across the canvas until the shape of it was lost. She had barely gotten to her feet, barely brushed the worst of the soot from her hands, when the sound outside stopped, and a horse blew hard through its nose just beyond the wall, and boots came down heavy on the frozen ground. She stood in the center of the room with her heart slamming against her ribs and made herself breathe. The fire crackled. The satchel hung heavy at her hip. Through the broken window came the small sounds of a man dismounting, of leather and buckle, and the stamp of a tired horse, then footsteps on the porch, slow, testing the rotten boards. The door handle rattled, met the resistance of the rusted padlock, and went still. There was a pause. And then, without any word of warning, a boot struck the door just below the lock, and the old wood shuddered. It struck again, and the ancient hinges tore from their seating, and the heavy oak door burst inward on a swirl of driven snow and gray light. And a man filled the doorway, ducking his head beneath the low frame as he came. He was a big man, made bigger by the heavy fur-collared coat he wore, his face wrapped against the cold to the eyes, a hat pulled low and slung across his back. On a leather strap was a rifle, its barrel dark against the white behind him. He stepped inside, into the warmth and firelight, pushed the wrappings down from his face, and looked at her with the flat, assessing calm of a man who had expected to find something here, and was not surprised to find it breathing. Cold morning to be so far from anywhere. His voice was low and unhurried, carrying the drawl of a man who had spent his life in high country. He kicked what remained of the door, shut behind him against the wind, brought the rifle around off his shoulder, and held it loose and easy across both forearms, not pointed at her, not pointed away. His eyes moved past her as he spoke, taking a slow inventory of the room, the fire, the broken chair, the pried-open toolbox, the whole disturbed and wakened silence of a place that should have lain still. Saw the smoke off the ridge at first light. Figured I'd come see what fool had wandered up into my employer's country. She kept her voice even, and she was distantly proud of how even she kept it. My wagon broke an axle 2 miles back. My horse ran off in the storm. I only wanted to live through the night. She let her hand rest at her side, near the satchel, not touching it. I didn't know the land was held. I'll pay for the door and the window. I only need pointing toward the nearest town. Oh, it's held. He took a step further in, his boots leaving dark prints in the dust, the firelight moving on the planes of a square-weathered face, and eyes that gave back nothing. All of it, up and down this valley and over the next ridge besides. Harkerland has been my whole life, and my father's before me. He let the name fall into the room and watched what it did to her, and she gave it nothing, though her stomach had turned to water at the sound of it. Name's Silas Rourke. I keep the peace on the family's ground. Been keeping it a long time. She inclined her head as though the name meant nothing to her, and reached for the ordinary courtesies of a stranded traveler. Offering again to pay, asking again for the road, filling the air with the small, reasonable words of a woman who wanted only to be gone. He was not listening. His gaze had left her and traveled the room again, slower this time, and she watched it move and felt the first true edge of fear as it went. Because she could not remember, could not for her life remember, whether she had left anything of the box in view. His eyes reached the hearth, and they stopped. There, on the gray stone of the fireplace, plain in the firelight, lay the broken brass padlock she had pried from the box that morning, its metal bright and clean, where the bar had scored it, entirely free of the dust that furred every other surface in the room. Beside it, unmistakable to any man who had spent years hunting for this very thing, lay the charred and blackened square of fireproof cloth that had wrapped a steel box up a chimney for 24 years. The change in him was not loud. That was the worst of it, that it made no sound at all. The easy set went out of his shoulders and something colder took its place, and when his eyes came back to her, they had changed as well, all the lazy courtesy gone out of them. And what remained was the flat, patient attention of a man who has found, after a long search, the thing he was sent to find, and has only to decide now what to do about the person who found it first. The silence between them stretched until it had a texture she could feel against her skin, like the cold coming through the broken door. Silas Rourke did not raise the rifle. He did not need to. He let his gaze travel once more from the padlock to her face, and in that unhurried movement, she read the whole arithmetic of her situation. That he had come up the mountain, expecting an intruder, and had found, instead, the end of a search his employers had been conducting for the better part of her lifetime. You've had a busy morning. He crossed to the hearth and crouched, keeping the rifle balanced across one knee, and lifted the scorched square of cloth between two gloved fingers. He turned it in the firelight, studying the char at its edges, the way the fibers had been woven tight against heat, and something like satisfaction moved beneath the weathered surface of his face. 24 years old, this weave, or near enough. A man doesn't wrap his supper in cloth like this. He wraps a thing he's afraid of fire, and afraid of finding. He set it down with a care more menacing than roughness would have been. Old Josiah went to his grave certain this box had burned or washed into a creek. Sent men up here every spring thaw for years. I was one of them, back when I was young enough to believe in it. He rose to his full height, and the crown of his hat nearly brushed the low ceiling. Where is it? She had prepared for the question in the seconds she had, and the lie came out steady, which surprised her. There's a ledge up inside the chimney. That's where the cloth was. I could feel the box up there, but I couldn't shift it loose. My hands were half frozen through. She let a note of complaint into her voice, the aggrieved tone of a woman who had found a fortune and been cheated of it by her own weakness. It's wedged solid. You'll need to reach up past the damper. I gave it up as more than I could manage. He looked at her, and she could not tell whether he believed her, and the not knowing was its own kind of cold. His eyes went to the black throat of the fireplace, then back to her, weighing the two against each other, the woman and the shaft, deciding which held the greater risk of costing him what he had come for. You'll understand, he said at last. if I don't take a stranger's word on where the most valuable thing in this territory happens to be. He gestured with the rifle's barrel toward the corner nearest the bed, away from the door, away from anything she might use. Sit. Over there. Hands where the fire shows them. She moved to obey, slow, and every inch of the distance she crossed carried her nearer the iron bedstead, beneath which the box lay hidden, and the irony of it turned in her like a blade. She lowered herself to the floor against the wall, her back to the cold logs, the satchel with its terrible cargo pressed between her hip and the base of the bed frame, where his eyes did not follow it. He watched her settle. Then, he set the rifle down within his own easy reach against the table, close enough that she understood the message, and he went to the hearth and knelt before the fireplace, with his back half toward her. That was his mistake, and she saw it the moment he made it. The broad expanse of his shoulders turned 3/4 away, as he thrust his arm up into the chimney to feel for a box that was not there. She did not move. She had learned, in 3 seasons of high country work among rough men, that the first opening was rarely the true one, that the body's urge to act at the earliest chance was a thing to be governed. She waited, her hands flat on the cold floor, her weight already gathered beneath her, watching his arm disappear into the soot to the elbow, watching his cheek press against the stone as he strained upward, watching him become, for a handful of seconds, a man wholly occupied with something other than her. There's nothing up here. His voice had gone tight with the beginning of an ugly understanding. Higher. She was already rising. There's a second ledge above the first. His arm reached higher. His face turned fully to the stone, and she came up off the floor without a sound, took 3 swift steps, and closed her hand around the barrel of the rifle where it leaned against the table. He heard the scrape of it and came out of the chimney fast, faster than a man his size had any right to move, twisting around with soot-streaked black across one side of his face, but she had already stepped back, out of his reach with the weapon in both hands and the muzzle rising toward the center of his chest. For a frozen instant, neither of them breathed. The fire snapped. Snow ticked against the one-hole window. She had never held a rifle on a living man, and her hands were not as steady as she needed them to be, and she thought he could probably see that. Easy. He lifted his blackened hands slowly to the level of his shoulders, and his eyes were doing a different arithmetic now, gauging the tremor in her grip, the distance between them, the seconds it would take him to cross it. That's a lot of gun for a lady who draws pictures. It kicks harder than you're expecting. You'll put a hole in the roof, most likely, and then we'll be right back where we started. Only I'll be less inclined to be gentle about it. Move away from the fire. She was proud that her voice did not shake, even though her hands did. Toward the door. Slowly. He did not move. He tilted his head, studying her with a frank curiosity that was somehow worse than threat. You read the letter. It was not a question. Something in her face must have told him, some residue of the dead man's grief she had not managed to scrub away. There was always supposed to be a letter. Josiah talked about it near the end, when the drink loosened him. Thorncroft's confession, he called it. The thing that could hang a dead man's whole family. He lowered his hands a careful inch, testing her, and when the muzzle jerked, he raised them again with a thin smile. You know what you're holding then, which means you know it's worth more than your life to certain people. You've made yourself a problem, drawing lady. The kind of problem that doesn't get to walk down off this mountain. My name is Adelia Voss. She did not know why she said it, except that he had reduced her to a function, the drawing lady, the problem, and some stubborn core of her refused it. And I'm going to walk down off this mountain. You're going to help me, or you're going to get out of my way. Am I? He shifted his weight, and she saw the movement begin in his knees before it reached anywhere else. The coiling of a man about to spring, and she understood that words had run out, that he had measured her and found her wanting, that in the next half-second he would come across the room and take the rifle from her, or die trying, and probably not die. She did the only thing left to her. She swung the muzzle a foot to the left of him and pulled the trigger. The report in that small stone room was a physical blow, a slam of sound and light that struck her ears deaf and drove the butt back into her shoulder, hard enough to spin her half around. A section of the chimney's upper stonework blew apart, chips of rock and a choking gout of ancient soot raining down across the hearth, and Silas Rourke flinched back from the impact with his arms thrown up across his face. She did not wait to see more. She worked the lever the way she had watched hunters work it in a dozen camps, chambering the next round with emotion her hands remembered better than her mind did. And when he lowered his arms, the muzzle was fixed on him again, and the smoke drifting between them had changed everything. He was very still now. The smile was gone. He looked at the ruined stone where the ball had struck, a hand's width from where his head had been. Then he looked at her, and for the first time something in his face allowed that she might actually do it. "You missed," he said, but a question hid inside it. "I didn't." She let the truth of it sit in the air. Moved to the door. This time he moved. He backed toward the shattered doorway with his hands high and his eyes never leaving her, stepping over the splintered remains of the door he had kicked in, the gray daylight and the cold coming up around him as he crossed into it. She followed at a distance she judged just too great for him to close. The rifle trained on the broad target of his chest, her mind racing ahead to the horse she knew stood somewhere beyond the wall, to the buried slope, to the impossible arithmetic of getting down a mountain in a standoff with a man who wanted her dead. He stopped in the doorway, filling it, the storm's gray light behind him. "You'll never make the valley." It was not a threat now so much as a fact laid down between them. "Not in this. Not with a green horse and no road. And even if you do, even if the Almighty carries you down to Camas Junction on angel's wings, you don't understand what you're walking into. There isn't a badge in this county Cornelius Harker doesn't own. There isn't a judge, a marshal, a station master, a telegraph key that isn't his. You'll hand that book to a lawman and the lawman will hand it back to me. And we'll be standing right here again. Except you'll have used up all your luck getting down and back up." He let that settle. "Give it to me now, and I'll tell them the box was empty. Rotted through. You crawled in here half dead and found nothing but a dead trapper's junk. You walk down, you go back east, you draw your little pictures, you live. That's the only door out of this cabin that doesn't end badly for you. I'm the only door." For a moment, the offer had weight, because he was not wrong about the mountain, and he might not be wrong about the county. She thought of the letter against her hip, the pressed hard words of a man who had made exactly this calculation 24 years before and chosen the mountain over the men with badges, and died for the choosing, and been right. Do not trust any man who wears a badge there. She thought of the dead man's love folded against her side, and of the woman it was meant for, and of a promise that had waited a quarter century for someone with the nerve to keep it. A man already tried, keeping quiet and letting your people win. Her voice came out harder than she expected. "He's still up here somewhere under the snow. I don't think silence bought him what he was promised either." She gestured with the barrel, a small, sharp movement. "The horse. Where is it?" His jaw tightened. "Around the north corner, tied to the porch rail." His eyes flicked past her, once, toward the bed, and she knew he was still hunting the box even now, still calculating, and she knew that the instant she was out of sight, he would tear the cabin apart and find it in under a minute, and that the box could not be her concern. Only the book and the letter. Only the things already against her side. "Walk out ahead of me." To the horse. He went, and she came behind, out onto the groaning porch, and down into snow that took her to mid-thigh at the step, the cold biting instantly through the layers she had only just managed to dry. The storm had gentled to a steady grainy fall, the light flat and shadowless, the whole world reduced to white and the dark uprights of the pines. The horse stood where he had said, a rangy bay with frost in its mane, tied to the rail and stamping against the cold, a bedroll and saddlebags lashed behind the cantle. It was a real horse, a mountain horse, worth 10 of the nervous roan that had abandoned her, and the sight of it was the first thing in an hour that felt like hope. "Untie it, then step back, 10 paces, into the open, where I can see all of you." He worked the knot loose with slow, deliberate fingers. and she watched his hands and his shoulders and the middle distance for any sign he had not come alone. And when he had freed the reins, he backed away from the animal through the snow, counting his steps aloud in a flat, mocking cadence until he stood a good 30 feet off, with the white all around him, and nothing near him but his own long shadow. She came to the horse. It rolled an eye at her and shied, and she made a low sound in her throat that her years of camp work had taught her, and it settled enough to let her gather the reins. Getting up into the saddle with a rifle in one hand and a satchel banging at her hip, in skirts stiff with cold, was a graceless struggle that left her heart pounding. But she got a boot in the stirrup and swung up and squared herself in the seat. And from the horse's back, the world looked briefly manageable. You're leaving me on a mountain in a blizzard with no horse. There was a new note under the mockery now, a genuine edge. That's a killing thing to do to a man. You walked up here. She gathered the reins. There's a cabin with a fire behind you and wood enough to burn for a week. That's more mercy than your employer showed the man who built the fireplace you were digging in. She looked at him a last time, this large, calm, dangerous man standing hip-deep in the snow he had meant to bury her in, and she found she had no more words for him. She turned the horse's head downhill. They'll know your name by nightfall, Adelia Voss. Her own name in his mouth was a threat all its own. There's nowhere in this territory that name won't reach. She did not answer. She put her heels to the horse and rode. The going was terrible from the first stride. The snow lay deep and treacherous, over ground she could not see, and the bay lurched and floundered through drifts that swallowed its legs to the chest. And more than once she felt it stumble on some buried deadfall, and catch itself with a violence that nearly threw her. She had no road. The trace she had traveled the day before was gone, erased utterly, and the storm had taken even the memory of which way was which. So she rode by the pull of the slope alone, letting the mountain's own tilt carry her downward, trusting that down was toward the valley and the rail line and the thin possibility of the world. But she was not without a thread to follow, and the thread was of her own making. All that autumn she had ridden this country, marking the proposed line, and at every station of her survey, she had driven a lath stake into the ground, and tied to it a strip of red flannel bright markers meant to guide the men who would come after her, with their chains and transits. She had cursed the tedium of it at the time. Now, riding blind down a killing slope, she hunted the white ahead for those small red flags, with the desperation of a drowning woman hunting the shore. And when the first one rose out of the snow 20 yards off her right hand, a torn ribbon of scarlet snapping on its stake above the drifts, she nearly wept at the sight of it. She turned the horse toward it. Beyond it, she knew, if she could find it, would be another, and another, a broken trail of her own leaving that ran all the way down to the valley floor. She wrapped the frozen reins twice around her wrist, so a stumble could not tear them from her numb fingers, the way the roan had torn free, and she rode from red flag to red flag through a world without color. And behind her, somewhere in the gray, she knew a man was already walking, and that a walking man on a mountain he knew was not so much slower than a horse floundering down a mountain it did not. The light was failing by the time the slope began to ease. She had ridden for hours, and the cold had worked so deep into her that she had stopped shivering, which she knew from the night before was the body's final treachery. And she fought it now with everything she had, biting the inside of her cheek, flexing her fingers against the reins, speaking aloud to the horse in a cracked voice, just to keep her own mind turning over. The pines thinned, the ground leveled, and then, through a last screen of trees, she saw below her the long pale scar of a cleared grade, running straight across the land where nothing natural ran straight. The railroad cut, the line she had come to draw, and beside it, small and dark and smoking against the snow, the buildings of a place she knew. Kama's Junction was hardly a town. It was a water tank and a coaling stage and a low depot building of unpainted board, a section house where the track crew wintered, a store, a scatter of shanties, all of it strung along the single line where the branch met the through route. But smoke rose from 3 chimneys, and lamplight glowed yellow in the depot window against the blue dusk. and there were human beings in it. And after a day and a night, alone with the cold and the dead, she rode down toward that lamplight like a soul riding toward the gates of somewhere warm. She left the exhausted horse at the rail before the depot, half fell out of the saddle, and pushed through the door into a wave of heat and lamplight, and the smell of coal smoke and coffee that nearly took her legs out from under her. A pot-bellied stove roared in the corner. A man in a station master's vest and green eyeshade looked up from a desk cluttered with waybills and the brass instrument of a telegraph key, and his mouth fell open at the sight of her, this snow-caked apparition. Of a woman, Cess, of a woman with a hunting rifle in her hand, and eyes gone wide and glittering with the particular brightness of someone who has been too long in the cold. Good Lord, ma'am. He was on his feet at once, coming around the desk. Your near froze through. Sit, sit, get to the stove. Let me. He reached for the rifle and she let him take it, too spent to hold it, and he set it aside and steered her to a bench by the stove and put a tin cup of coffee into her hands so hot it burned her cracked fingers, and the burning was wonderful. Where in creation did you come from? There's not been a soul come down off that mountain in a week, not in this. I have to send a telegram. The words came out of her in a rush, her voice a stranger's rasp. To the federal marshals. At Boise, I have information they need. A crime, an old one, and men who mean to keep it hidden. She gripped his sleeve with a hand that would not quite close. It has to go tonight. Before anyone else knows I'm here. Something moved across the station master's kind broad face. A flicker, gone almost before she caught it. But she had spent her life training her eye to catch exactly such things, the small betraying shift beneath a composed surface. He patted her hand and made a soothing sound and told her, of course, first let her get warm. First let her get some of that coffee into her. The wire wasn't going anywhere. He turned back toward his desk, and she watched him, and she saw his eyes drop for the briefest instant to a printed notice pinned to the wall above the telegraph key, and she followed his glance, and even at that distance, even in the lamplight, she could read the heavy black letters across the top of it. Harker for governor. The warmth went out of the room. She understood, with the plummeting certainty of a person who has trusted the wrong door, that she had ridden all day down a killing mountain to arrive in the one place in the valley most surely owned by the man she was fleeing. The station master's kindness was real. She did not doubt it. But it was the kindness of a man who owed his livelihood, his section house, the very key beneath his hand, to the Harker line, and who would no more send a wire against the Harker interest than set fire to his own roof. You know, he offered, settling back at his desk with an ease that had grown a fraction too careful. The marshals are a long way off, and the wire to Boise runs through a good many hands before it gets there. Relay stations. Night operators. You never know who's reading. A thing as delicate as you're describing. Seems to me you'd want to carry it yourself, in your own hand, where nobody can read it off a wire. He smiled at her, and the smile was meant to be helpful and was, she thought, even sincere in its way, and it was the most dangerous thing she had seen all day. Through train comes at first light, headed south to the capital. I could see you onto it myself. Warm car, safe passage. You'd be in Boise by tomorrow evening, with your papers right there in your bag where nobody's touched them. It was very good advice, and it was also a snare. And the terrible thing was, she could not tell how much of it was which. Perhaps he only wanted her gone. This stranger with her rifle and her wild talk of old crimes. Gone and out of his quiet station, and no longer his concern. Perhaps he meant, the moment she slept by his stove, to tap out a very different message on that brass key. A message south to a campaign office, or east to a man on a mountain, telling them where the drawing lady had gone to ground. She could not know. She could only choose, and she had learned that day that the wrong choice up here offered no second chances. That's kind of you. She made her voice small and grateful and exhausted, which required no acting at all. You're right. Of course you're right. I'm not thinking clearly. I've been so long in the cold. She let her shoulders come down, let herself sag toward the warmth of the stove, the very picture of a woman surrendering to sense and safety. The morning train. Thank you. I'll rest till then. if there's a corner you can spare. Relief smoothed the station master's face, and she hated that she understood it. That some part of him was simply glad the problem had resolved itself into something manageable. He found her a horsehair sofa in the freight office off the main room, a moth-eaten buffalo robe to lie under, and he trimmed the lamp low and told her to sleep, that he'd wake her before the train, that everything would look better by daylight. He drew the door mostly shut between the two rooms. She lay down on the sofa in her stiff, cold clothes, with the satchel clutched to her chest beneath the robe, and she closed her eyes, and she listened. For a long while, there was only the tick of the stove, and the wind and the small sounds of a man closing up a station for the night. Then, when he must have judged her asleep, she heard it, faint and deliberate through the not-quite-shut door, the light, rapid chatter of the telegraph key. A long transmission tapped out fast by a practiced hand, far too long to be a routine dispatch about a morning train. She lay rigid beneath the buffalo robe and counted the bursts and could not read them, for she knew nothing of the code, but she did not need to read them. A station master at midnight did not send a long private wire about a stranded woman for any purpose that served the stranded woman. She had perhaps until morning, perhaps a good deal less. She let another quarter-hour pass, forcing herself to lie still, while the key fell silent and the station master's footsteps crossed the outer room and a chair creaked as he settled, likely to doze at his desk. Then she rose from the sofa without a sound, her cold, stiffened joints protesting, and she stood in the dark freight office and made herself think past the fear to the shape of the place. She had ridden through Camas Junction twice that autumn. She knew the through train ran south at dawn, as he had said, but she knew also it was not the only train. A work train, an irregular, ran up the branch in the small hours some nights that season, hauling ties and rail and coal to the end-of-track camps, running north and west, away from the capital, away from the heart of the Harker country. She had heard the crews curse its schedule. If it ran tonight, if she could reach it, it would carry her not south into the arms of the campaign, but out, toward the main line and the wider world, and somewhere far down its length, a division point large enough to hold a federal office no single county boss could own entire. She could not take the horse. A horse leaving in the night would wake the station master and announce her direction as plainly as a shout. She would have to go on foot, out across the yard, to the branch siding where the work train made up. And she would have to do it in the dark, and the cold with a man dozing 40 feet away who had already sold her once. She eased the freight room's outer door, open against the cold, wincing at the groan of it, and slipped out into the night. The snow had stopped. The clouds had torn open to show a hard, brilliant scatter of stars and a pairing of moon, and by their light, the rail yard lay before her, in shades of blue and black, the water tank looming, the coaling stage a dark skeleton, the tracks running out in gleaming parallel lines toward the throat of the yard, where the branch curved away north. Cold seized her at once, but she was past minding cold. It was only weather now, and weather she could bear. She kept to the shadow of the depot wall and moved along it, her boots finding the packed snow between the rails where she left the shallowest track. Working toward the dark string of cars, she could just make out on the branch siding, flat cars, stacked, with rail, and a single caboose at the tail, with no light showing. She was halfway across the open ground of the yard, exposed under the pitiless stars, when she heard the horse. It came from the south, from the through line, the muffled drumbeat of a hard-ridden animal on packed snow, and it came fast, far faster than anything should move on such a night, which meant a rider who did not care whether he ruined the horse under him. She dropped into the black shadow of a stopped boxcar and pressed herself against the frozen iron of its wheels, and watched a single rider come pounding up the grade into the reach of the depot lamp, haul his lathered mount to a plunging stop, and swing down before it had fully halted. He was tall, and he wore a long dark coat, and even at that distance, even by lamplight, she saw the star pinned to his breast catch the light and throw it back, and she understood that the station master's midnight wire had reached its mark, and that the mark had ridden through the night to answer it and that the man crossing to the depot door with his hand resting easy on the pistol at his hip was a deputy of the county she had been warned by a dead man never to trust. The station master's door opened to a spill of lamplight, and the two men stood a moment framed in it, and she heard the low, urgent murmur of their voices, though not the words. And she saw the station master gesture back toward the freight office, where a woman was supposed to be sleeping under a buffalo robe, with a satchel full of ruin clutched to her chest. She did not wait to see the deputy's face when he found the sofa empty. She turned and ran, low and fast, across the last of the open yard toward the dark cars on the siding, her breath tearing out of her in ragged plumes, her boots slipping on the frozen ballast, expecting with every stride to hear a shout behind her, a shot, the drum of pursuit. She reached the work-train string of cars and threw herself into the black gap between two flats loaded high with steel rail, and she crouched there in the deep shadow with her heart hammering against the satchel, and made herself breathe slow and quiet. From the depot came a raised voice, the deputy's, sharp with anger, then the station master's, placating, then the swing of a lantern beam across the yard as they came out to hunt for her. She pressed lower. The lantern light slid along the sides of the cars, throwing the stacked rail into ridges of shadow, and passed over the gap where she hid without pausing, moving on toward the section house, the two men reasoning, she supposed, that a fleeing woman would run for shelter and warmth rather than out into the killing yard. Then, from somewhere up the branch to the north, came a sound that changed everything. The long, mournful cry of a locomotive whistle, and beneath it, the labored chuff of an engine working hard against a grade. The work train. It was not making up in the yard at all. It was already running, already coming down the branch from the end of track with its load, and it would pass through the junction without stoppage, or with barely a pause to take water. And if she meant to be aboard, she had moments, not minutes, to reach it. The lantern beam swung back toward the sound. The two men had heard it too, and she saw them turn, saw the deputy start toward the branch line at a dead run, understanding as quickly as she had what a woman on the run might do with a train. She broke from cover. She ran along the string of standing cars toward the main branch track where the moving train would pass, her satchel clutched against her side, her lungs full of knives, and behind her she heard the deputy shout at last. Her name, Adelia Voss, flung across the frozen yard in a voice full of the certainty of ownership, and it gave her the last of what she had. The locomotive came around the curve at the head of the branch with its single great lamp blazing, throwing a long shaking cone of light down the snow-covered rails, and it bore down on the junction slower than a through train, but faster than a running woman. A black mass of iron-breathing smoke and steam into the starlight. She angled toward the track ahead of it, toward a low spot where the grade brought the cars down almost to the level of the ground. And she saw the engine pass her in a roar of heat and cinders and thunder, saw the tender rush by, saw the first of the loaded flat cars come on with their ladders and their grab irons and their stirrups of cold steel. She did not let herself think about the wheels. She had watched brakemen swing aboard, moving cars 100 times that autumn, an easy, careless grace. And she fixed her eye on a grab iron, rising out of the dark at the corner of a flat car, and she ran alongside it, matching the train's slow thunder, and she reached up and closed both frozen hands around the freezing iron and jumped. The train took her weight and tore her off her feet and swung her hard against the side of the car, her boots scrabbling for the stirrup step, her shoulder wrenching in its socket, the satchel strap biting into her neck. And for one endless, terrifying instant, she hung there half on and half off, a moving train in the dark with the ground and the wheels rushing beneath her. Then her boot found the step, and she hauled with everything she had left, and she dragged herself up onto the narrow end platform of the flat car and lay there against the cold steel of the rail load, shaking, deafened, alive, as Camas Junction and its lamplight and its shouting deputy fell away behind her into the dark. Somewhere back there, a voice still called her name, thinner now, swallowed by distance and the roar of the engine, and then it was gone, and there was only the train and the night and the cold, rushing wind, carrying her north and west toward, she did not yet know where, away from the men who owned the valley, deeper into a country where the name Harker might not reach. She lay against the shifting steel and got her breath back and took stock of what she had. Her hands were bleeding where the iron had torn them, the cold having numbed the pain until she saw the dark stain on the snow-crusted rail beneath her. Her shoulder throbbed where the jerk of boarding had wrenched it. She had lost the rifle, left behind on the depot bench, and she had lost the stolen horse. And she had lost the fragile hope that the nearest lawman would be an ally rather than an enemy. But the satchel was still against her side, its strap cutting into her neck, and inside it, dry and safe, lay the leather journal that could bring down a governor, and the letter that could keep a promise, and the folio of survey sketches that was, she would soon find, worth more than she yet knew. As long as those things rode with her, she was not beaten, only running. She worked her way forward along the pitching flat car in the darkness, keeping low against the load, until she found a pocket of shelter in the lee of the stacked rail, where the wind could not reach her directly. And she wedged herself into it and drew the collar of her ruined coat up around her ears. The train rocked and swayed beneath her, the wheels beating their iron rhythm over the joints, the great engine ahead laboring and then easing as the grade fell away toward the main line. Above her the stars wheeled cold and clear in a sky swept clean of storm. She thought of Silas Rourke walking down off the mountain in that same starlight, and of the deputy left cursing in the yard, and of the station master, who had betrayed her out of nothing worse than the need to keep his roof, and she understood that she had made enemies that night whose reach she could not yet measure. She thought, too, of the man who had ridden this same range 24 winters gone, carrying the same terrible cargo and the same knowledge that every badge in the county belonged to the man hunting him. And she felt across all those years a kinship with him so sharp it was nearly grief. He had run for 2 days and never reached his valley. She was running still, and her own valley, whatever it was, lay somewhere down this cold length of rail she could not see the end of, in a city she had never seen. Behind a federal door she could only pray no single county boss could hold shut. She held the satchel against her chest the way he had written of holding a name cupped against the wind, and she did not let herself sleep, for sleep in that cold was the last lie, and she had one promise left to keep, and a long way yet to carry it. Far down the line where the branch would meet the main, a faint paling had begun to gather at the edge of the sky, the first thin gray suggestion of a morning she had not been sure she would live to see, and she fixed her eyes on it and held on. The gray had become a hard white light by the time the work train slowed for the division yards at Sawtell, and Adelia knew from the change in the wheel's rhythm, the long, groaning drag of the brakes, that she had reached a place large enough to swallow a single woman among its comings and goings. She had spent the last hours of the night working the stiffness from her torn hands, binding them in strips torn from her petticoat, and she had made a plan out of the scraps of what she knew. Sawtell was a real town, a roundhouse town where two lines crossed, and where two lines crossed, there was traffic enough that no station master could know every face. No deputy could watch every platform. She would get down before the train fully stopped, before it reached the yard office where men would be waiting for its crew, and she would lose herself in the ordinary morning of a working town. She swung off the flat car while it still rolled at a walking pace, dropping into the cinders beside the track and folding at once into a crouch behind a stack of ties. And she watched the train grind on toward the yard without her. The town lay before her in the flat winter light, a jumble of frame buildings and false fronts, strung along a rutted main street, smoke, standing straight up from 100 stovepipes into the windless cold. Nobody had marked her descent. She straightened her ruined coat, drew her collar up to hide the worst of the soot on her neck, tucked her bound hands into her sleeves, and walked out from behind the ties into the street like a woman who belonged there, the satchel held close beneath her arm. Hunger had become a physical pain, a hollow gnawing that made her lightheaded, and she had only the coins she had carried up the mountain, a few silver pieces in the bottom of her pocket, meant to pay for a night at a wayside inn. She found a low eating house near the depot, where teamsters and railmen crowded the counter, and she took a stool in the corner with her back to the wall, where she could see the door, and she ate a plate of eggs and fried potatoes and drank 2 cups of scalding coffee. And the warmth of the food did more to steady her mind than anything had since she broke the wax on the dead man's letter. She listened while she ate. Railmen talk, always, and she let their talk wash over her while she hunted it for anything she needed. She needed a train west or north toward Boise, toward the federal court and the marshal's office, and she needed to know when it ran and whether the Harker Reach gripped this crossing town surely as it had gripped the little junction in the valley. The first question the counter-talk answered readily. The westbound express through to the capital came at midday, 5 hours off. The second question answered itself in a way that turned the eggs to lead in her stomach. 2 men in good coats came into the eating house while she sat there, not railmen, their boots too clean, their eyes moving over the room in a way that working men's eyes did not. And they took a table near the door and ordered coffee they did not drink. And one of them held a folded paper he consulted and then studied the faces at the counter against. She did not need to see the paper to know what it carried. The station master's midnight wire had gone further than one deputy in one valley. It had gone out along the whole length of the line, to every crossing and division point a fleeing woman might reach. And the Harker interest had put men on the platforms of every town where the branch met the world. She lowered her face over her cup and let her hair fall forward and made herself small. And she thought, with a cold clarity that had become her only companion, that she had been foolish to imagine a working town would be safer than a lonely junction. A lonely junction had one betrayer. A crossing town could hold a dozen, and she had walked into the middle of them with the proof of a governor's ruin under her arm. The 2 men worked the room without hurry, moving from the counter to the tables, showing their folded paper, asking their low questions, and she understood. She had perhaps 2 minutes before they reached her corner. She could not go out the front. She rose as if to leave by the rear, unhurried. A woman who had finished her meal, and she carried her empty plate to the pass-through, as though she were the sort who tidied after herself. And she stepped through the swinging door into the heat and clatter of the kitchen before either man had finished the table he was working. A cook looked up from his range, startled, and she gave him a tired smile and a murmured word about the necessary outback, and she was through the kitchen and out the rear door into a frozen alley of ash barrels and stacked crates before he thought to question her. She did not run. Running drew the eye. She walked the alley to its end, came out on a side street, and walked that, putting corners and buildings between herself and the eating house, her mind racing ahead of her feet. 5 hours until the westbound men with her description walking every platform, and no possible way to stand on the depot boards that long without being seen. The train was a trap now. They would watch it more closely than anything, for they knew as well as she did that a woman running for the federal court in Boise would need to be aborted. She needed another way west, or she needed to become someone the folded paper did not describe. And she had a few silver coins and her wits to purchase either one. The answer came from a hand-lettered notice in the window of a mercantile she passed, an ordinary handbill, among the others advertising a wagon freighting concern, daily surfaced, to Mountain, Home, and Points West, and beneath it the name of a proprietor and the location of his barn at the west end of town. A freight wagon would be slow, far slower than the express, but it would not be watched, for no one hunting a woman in a hurry would think to look for her on a lumbering freighter creeping west at the pace of a walking mule. And Mountain Home, she knew from her survey maps, sat on the main line closer to the capital, a place she might board a train. The Harker men were not watching because they did not expect her to reach it. She found the freight barn by its smell, the warm ammoniac reek of stabled mules, and she found the proprietor forking hay in the gloom, a broad slab of a man with a gray mustache stained yellow at its edges, and the deliberate manner of someone who had long since stopped hurrying for anyone. She told him a story she had built on the walk over, one with just enough truth in it to hold its shape, that she was a railroad illustrator stranded by a broken wagon in the high country, that she had lost her outfit and her horse in the storm, that she needed to reach the main line at Mountain Home to rejoin her survey party, and had no patience for waiting on the express. She showed him her folio, the clean, confident renderings of ridgelines and cuts and grades, and the sketches did more to sell her than any words, for they were plainly the work of exactly who she claimed to be. He looked at the drawings a long while, turning the stiff pages with a hay-caloosed thumb. Cold time of year to freight a lady over the pass. His small eyes came up to study her face, the soot she had not fully cleaned, the raw scrapes at her wrists where the bindings showed. You're in a considerable hurry, for someone rejoining a survey that won't move again till spring thaw. My employer doesn't wait on the weather, and neither do his creditors. She held his gaze and let a working woman's weary exasperation carry the lie. I've a report due in the capital that half the men on that survey are counting on to keep their winter wages. I mean, to put it in the right hands before the month's out, and I'll pay for the seat, and I'll not slow you down. She laid her coins on the feed and between them, all of them, and it was not enough for the passage, and they both knew it. It's what I have. I'll owe you the rest against my word. He looked at the coins, and he looked at the woman, and something in his weathered calm shifted toward a decision. Keep your silver. You'll need it worse than I will where you're going. He forked another armful of hay into a stall. I've hauled for that railroad 3 years and never once been paid on time. So I know the breed you work for, and I know they'd leave you to freeze before they'd hold a train. Climb up in the wagon and get under the canvas. We roll in an hour, soon as I've loaded. He paused, and his eyes told her he had read more in her than she had said, that he knew a woman running when he saw one and had chosen not to know it aloud. Whatever you're carrying to the capital, it's your business. A man that hauls freight learns quick not to open the crates. The gratitude that rose in her was so sudden it nearly loosened tears she could not afford. And she swallowed it and gave him only a nod, because thanks spoken too warmly drew questions, and questions were the last thing either of them wanted. She climbed into the bed of the heavy wagon among the crates, and the mail sacks, burrowed into a nest of canvas and empty grain bags near the front, where the driver's seat would shield her from the road behind, and drew the satchel against her chest. And for the first time since the mountain, she let herself close her eyes, though she would not let herself sleep. The wagon rolled out of Sawtell within the hour, the mules leaning into their collars, the iron tires grinding over the frozen ruts, and Adelia lay hidden beneath the canvas, listening to the town fall away behind her. She heard the freighter exchange a word with someone at the edge of town, a casual greeting, no alarm in it, and she held her breath until the wheels had carried her past. Then the sounds of the town gave way to the wide silence of the open country, the wind across snow, the creak of harness, the freighter's low tuneless humming to his team, and she understood that she had slipped the net a second time, and that the third time might not come so cheaply. She lay in the swaying dark through the short winter afternoon, while the mules hauled her west and south toward the main line, and she used the time to think past her own flight toward the thing she had not let herself examine since she broke the seal. She had been so occupied with staying alive and staying free that she had not fully reckoned with what it would mean to succeed to reach the marshals and lay the journal before them and set the ruin of Cornelius Harker in motion. She had assumed, in the first shock of understanding, that the federal law would be clean where the county law was foul, that a marshal in Boise answered to Washington and not to a valley boss, and that the evidence, once delivered, would carry itself. Now, with hours of jolting silence to turn it over, she was no longer certain, and the uncertainty frightened her more than any deputy's star. For Cornelius Harker was not a mere county sheriff clutching stolen deeds. He was a man weeks from an election that would make him governor of the whole territory, whose name hung on handbills in every depot, whose reach had already stretched 100 miles of rail in a single night to put watchers on her trail. A man with that much to lose and that much bought and paid for might own more than county badges. He might own the very court she was running toward. The dead man had warned her against every badge in his county. But he had died before he learned whether the badges beyond it could be trusted either. And she was carrying his warning into country he had never lived to test. She might, she understood, be carrying the journal not toward justice, but toward the one place its destruction could be dressed up as law. The thought was unbearable, and she made herself bear it, because to walk blind into that possibility was worse than to face it. If she could not be sure the federal court in Boise was clean, then she could not simply hand the journal across a counter and trust it to a stranger's honor. She would need to make its contents known in some way no single official could suppress, spread wide enough that silencing the messenger no longer silenced the message. She thought of the newspapers, of the correspondents who followed a governor's race, of the plain fact that a scandal printed in 10,000 copies could not be pried out of a strong room and burned the way a single leather book could. The journal was her weapon, but the journal alone was fragile, one object that could be lost or stolen or sworn a forgery. What she needed was to turn one object into 1,000. To put the truth somewhere it could not be gathered back up. The plan took shape in her as the light failed for the second time, and it was a harder and lonelier plan than the one she had started with. She would not go first to the marshals. She would go first to a newspaper, to a press she had reason to believe stood outside the Harker reach, and she would put the story into print where it could not be recalled. And only then, with the truth already loose in the world, would she carry the journal itself to the federal court, where its suppression would serve no one because it would come too late. It meant more time, more exposure, more chances for the net to close. It also meant that if they took her before she reached the court, they would take a woman who had already spent her secret, and the dead man's evidence would go on working without her. A thing that is only in one pair of hands can be taken, she thought, but a thing that is in 1,000 cannot be stolen back. The freighter's wagon reached the outskirts of Mountain Home in the full dark of the third night, and the driver drew up in the shadow of a livery barn at the edge of town rather than at the freight depot where his arrival would be marked. He climbed down, came around to the back of the wagon, and drew aside the canvas, his broad face pale in the starlight, creased with a caution that had not been there in the barn at Sawtell. Word came up the line while you slept. He kept his voice low, though there was no one near. A teamster passed us this afternoon going the other way, stopped to water his team, had it fresh from Sawtell. They're hunting a woman all up and down this country. An illustrator, they're saying, traveling alone, wanted for the theft of a strongbox off Harker land. His eyes held hers in the dark. Robbery. That's the word they've put out. Nothing about old crimes or old letters. Just a thief who stole from the Harker family and ran. The cleverness of it struck her like cold water. They had not accused her of what she truly carried. Of course they had not. For to name the journal would be to name its contents. Instead, they had made her a common thief, a woman who had robbed a good and grieving family. And every honest man from here to the capital would help hunt her down, believing he did right. It was the most dangerous lie they could have told, because it turned her own innocence into a wall between herself and every person who might have helped her. She could not clear her name without producing the very thing they wanted destroyed, and producing it to the wrong person meant losing it forever. It isn't true. She heard how weak the words sounded, how exactly a thief would say them. The box wasn't theirs to be stolen. It belonged to a man they hunted to his death a long time ago, and what's in it proves what they are. That's what they're really after. Not a strong box. The truth about how the Harker fortune was made. The big man was quiet a long moment, and she could not read his face in the dark, could not tell whether she had just handed her freedom to a man who would collect a reward on it. I told you I don't open the crates I haul. There was a weariness in it, the weariness of a man deciding something against his own interest. But I'll tell you what I know, since you've been square with me. The Harkers have owned this stretch of country my whole life. My father lost 80 acres of good bottomland to old Josiah's paper when I was a boy, signed away for debts we never owed, and there was nothing to be done because the sheriff was the one holding the note, and the sheriff was the one who'd forged it. He drew a breath that fogged white. So when you tell me what's in that box proves what they are, you're not telling me a thing my family didn't learn the hard way 3 decades gone. I just never thought I'd meet the soul carrying the proof. She stared at him, this stranger who had freighted her 100 miles for a handful of silver he had refused. And she understood that the theft she carried threw a longer shadow than she had known, that the Harker fortune had been raised on the ruin of families, like his all up and down the territory, and that she was not, after all, entirely alone. Then help me put it where it can't be buried, she said. There's a newspaper, the Statesman in Boise, or any press that doesn't owe the Harkers its ink. If the story is printed before they catch me, it won't matter what happens to me. You'll not reach Boise by the express. Not now. He shook his head slowly. They'll have the platforms watched tighter than ever, with a robbery cried up and down the line. But there's more than one way into that city. He rubbed his jaw thinking, and she watched hope and calculation move together across his weathered features. My brother-in-law runs a mail contract on the Boise stage out of here, western route, leaves before dawn. It's a hard, cold ride, and it comes into the city from the south, not the depot, and no one watching the trains would think to watch the mail coach. He owes me more favors than he'll ever pay back. I can put you on it as a mail guard's wife riding to meet her husband, and there's not a soul on that route would look twice. The plan was thin, and it leaned on the goodwill of men she had never met, and it was the best chance she had, and she took it. The freighter walked her through the dark back streets of Mountain Home to a low adobe house where his sister lived. And the sister, a spare, quiet woman with the same steady eyes as her brother, took Adelia in without questions, gave her hot water to wash the soot and the mountain from her skin, gave her a clean dress of plain gray wool that fit near enough, and fed the ruined coat and skirt into the stove so the woman the handbills described would simply cease to exist. Adelia watched her survey clothes curl and blacken in the firebox and felt an odd wrench at it. The last of the illustrators she had been going up in smoke, replaced by whoever she was becoming on this road. In the gray hour before dawn, the mail coach came, and the brother-in-law, a lean, laconic man who asked nothing and was told nothing, handed her up onto the box beside him, as though she were exactly the mail guard's wife her borrowed story claimed. And the coach rolled out of Mountain Home into a stinging wind with the satchel tucked beneath the seat between her feet. She rode the long, cold miles into the rising day, with her face wrapped against the wind, and her mind fixed on the single object beneath her boots. And the country unrolled around her, white and vast and indifferent. The same country that had swallowed Elias Thorncroft and nearly swallowed her, carrying her at last toward the city where his ruin would be undone. They came down into Boise from the south in the middle of the afternoon, the coach rattling through streets busier than any Adelia had seen in months. A real city of brick blocks and telegraph wires, and a pale capital standing against the winter sky, and the sheer press of people in it was both a comfort and a terror. For a city could hide her, but a city could also hold 100 watchers she would never see. The mail guard set her down near the southern edge of the business district, tipped his hat with the same incurious calm he had worn all day, and drove his coach on toward the post office without a backward glance. And she stood alone on a strange, crowded corner with the whole weight of what she carried settling onto her shoulders. She found the newspaper by asking a boy selling papers on a corner, and she walked the 6 blocks to it, with her heart climbing higher in her throat at every step, rehearsing what she would say, how she would make a stranger believe in minutes what it had taken her, a night beside a fire, to grasp. The offices of the Statesman occupied the ground floor of a brick building on a busy street, the great flatbed press visible through the window at the rear, the front room crowded with desks, and the clatter of men writing against a deadline, and she pushed through the door into the ink and paper smell of it, and asked the first man she saw for the editor, saying it was a matter of a crime, an old death, and a fortune built upon it, and that she had the proof in her bag. The man she was brought to was gray and rumpled and sharp-eyed, an editor of the old combative school who had plainly heard 1,000 people claim to carry the story of the century. And he listened to her opening words with the practiced skepticism of a man waiting to be bored. Then she opened the satchel on his desk and laid the leather journal before him, opened it to the pages of names and dates and forged deeds in old Josiah Harker's own cramped hand, and set beside it the letter, the dead man's confession in its looping script. And she watched the boredom drain out of the editor's face and something far more dangerous take its place. He read a long time in silence, turning the brittle pages with the care of a man handling something that might burn him. And when he looked up, his eyes had changed entirely. "You understand what you've brought into my office?" It was not a question, but a kind of grim wonder. "You understand that the man these pages hang is 3 weeks from being governor of this territory, that his money sits in this paper's own bank, that half the advertisers on my back page do business with the Harker interests." He closed the journal slowly, his hand flat upon its cover. "You've brought me the story that either makes this newspaper or buries it, and I've not yet decided which, and neither, I think, have you. I've brought you the truth." She kept her voice level, though everything in her had begun to shake. "What you do with it is your choice to make. But I'll tell you what I learned coming down out of those mountains with it. A secret is only strong while one person holds it. The moment it's in 1,000 hands, no amount of money can gather it back." She leaned toward him across the desk. "They've cried me up and down the line as a thief who robbed the Harkers. Print what's in that book, and you don't only tell how they got their fortune. You tell why a woman is being hunted across the territory for carrying the proof of it." The editor rose and went to the window and looked out at the busy street a long moment, and she could see the war in the set of his shoulders, the newspaperman's hunger for the story of his life against the practical man's knowledge of what it would cost him. When he turned back, something had hardened in him. The hardness of a man who has made an expensive decision and does not mean to unmake it. "I've run this sheet 22 years. I've printed what the powerful didn't want, printed maybe a dozen times, and it cost me something every time. And every time I told myself the next time I'd be wiser and hold my peace." A thin, grim smile crossed his face. "I never did learn to be wiser. Sit down. I'll have every word of this set in type before I sleep, and I'll put it on the street tomorrow morning, and heaven help us both." For the space of one breath, she let herself believe it was one, that the truth was safe now in the hands of a man brave enough to print it. Then the door of the office opened behind her, letting in a gust of cold street air, and the editor's eyes moved past her shoulder toward whoever had entered, and the color drained from his weathered face. And she knew before she turned that the net had found her after all. The man who had come in wore a good dark coat and a marshal's star, and he was not alone. Two more filled the doorway behind him, hard-faced men with clean boots and the watchful eyes she had learned to fear, and the marshal held in his hand a folded paper she did not need to read. He looked past her to the editor with the easy authority of a man who had never in his life been refused. "I'm told a woman came in here a few minutes past." His voice was pleasant, which was the worst thing about it. "A woman wanted in connection with a robbery up in the high country. Theft of property belonging to the Harker family. I'll trouble you to point her out, and I'll trouble her to come along quiet." The editor's hand had not moved from the cover of the journal, and Adelia saw his fingers tighten upon it, saw him weigh in the space of a heartbeat everything he stood to lose against everything he had just promised. And she understood that the whole thing balanced now on the courage of a stranger she had known for 20 minutes. "There's no thief in my office, Marshal." His voice did not waver. "Only a witness, and the evidence she's brought me. And both are staying right here until I've heard what a judge outside this territory has to say about the property of the Harker family. You want to arrest someone? Start with me, and explain to the whole city tomorrow why a United States Marshal came to seize a newspaperman's papers the night before an election." The Marshal's pleasant expression did not change, But something behind it did, a recalculation. A man discovering that a thing he had expected to be simple had grown teeth. He looked from the editor to the woman to the leather book beneath the editor's hand. And Adelia watched him understand that the story was no longer contained in a single fleeing person he could quietly remove, that it had begun to spread into rooms and hands beyond his reach, and that every added minute it lived made it harder to kill. His gaze settled on the satchel, on the journal, on the one object that could still, if he took it now, be made to vanish. That book is stolen property. He took a step into the room. It comes with me. What's written in it is a matter for the courts, not a printing press, and I'll not have a newspaper trying a man in its columns 3 weeks before he's elected. Hand it over, and we'll let the law sort out the rest. The law. Adelia had risen from her chair, and she found that the fear which had ridden her for 3 days had burned away somewhere on the cold road and left behind it only a hard, bright anger. A man was robbed of everything his family owned by the law in this territory. He was hunted through the snow by the law. He died up there rather than trust the law, because the law wore the same star you're wearing now and answered to the same family. She did not step back from him. You can take the book. You're 3 armed men and I'm 1 woman with torn hands. And you can carry it out of this office by force if you choose. But it's already too late to take the truth, because this man has read it and I've told it. And tomorrow it's on the street whether the book is in your strong room or not. You can arrest me. You cannot unread what has already been read. For a long moment the marshal stood weighing her, weighing the editor, weighing the 2 other men in the doorway of a newspaper office in a city full of witnesses. And she saw the exact instant the calculation turned, saw him grasp that to seize the journal by force in front of a newspaperman on the eve of an election would print the very headline he had come to prevent. He was a man accustomed to doing his work in the dark corners of the territory, and there were no dark corners here, only the lamplit front room of a press, with the whole city walking past the window in the thing he had been sent to make quietly disappear, had become the loudest thing in the city merely by his coming for it. His hand came away from the pistol at his hip. You'll regret this. The pleasantness had gone out of his voice at last, leaving something colder and more honest. Both of you. There's power in this territory you don't begin to understand, and it does not forget the men who cross it. Perhaps not. The editor drew the journal a fraction closer, a small movement that settled the matter. But there's a power in a free press you've plainly forgotten, Marshal. And this city is about to be reminded of it. You know where to find me. I'll be here all night, setting tight. The marshal held his ground 1 moment longer, then turned on his heel and went out, taking his 2 hard-faced men with him, and the cold street air swirled in behind them as the door swung shut, and Adelia stood in the sudden quiet with her legs threatening to fold beneath her. She had won something in that room, she knew, but she knew too that she had not won it clean, that a man like that did not simply accept defeat and ride away, that he had gone out that door not beaten but delayed, and that between this moment and the moment the presses ran there stretched a whole long night in which a great deal could still go wrong. The editor was already moving, calling for his compositor, gathering the journal into his arms with the fiercer protectiveness of a man who had chosen his side and meant to hold it. That man will be back, he told her, and next time he'll come with something better than a robbery warrant. A court order, maybe. Something with a judge's name on it I can't turn away at my own door. We have until then, and it isn't long. He laid a hand on her shoulder, brief and firm. You've done the hard part. You carried it down off that mountain and across this territory and through that door. Now let me do mine. But you can't be here when he comes back, because the one thing that could still stop this story is if they take you tonight and make you the thief they've claimed. Get off the street. Get somewhere they won't look, and stay there until you see it printed. She understood the sense of it, even as everything in her rebelled against leaving the journal in another's hands, after guarding it with her life. And she made herself release it, made herself trust the gray, combative stranger who had chosen to risk his newspaper on her word. But there was one thing more she had carried down the mountain that had never belonged to a marshal or an editor or a court. One promise that was hers alone to keep. And as the editor's men began to set the dead man's crimes into cold metal type, she took up the letter from the desk where it lay beside the journal, the brittle folded pages with 3 words in looping ink across their face, and she slipped it back into her satchel against her chest. The book is yours to print. She closed the satchel over the letter. This was never part of the story. This is a thing I have to deliver myself, to the one person it was written for, before anyone else lays a hand on it. She met his questioning look and did not explain, because some promises grow smaller the more they are spoken aloud. There's a woman it was meant for, 24 years ago. If she's still living, she has waited a long time to be told she was loved to the end. I didn't carry this the length of a territory to let a marshal shut it in an evidence box. She drew the satchel strap over her head and settled its weight against her side. You put the truth on the street. I'll go put a man's last words in the hands they were meant for, and then they can arrest me. And I'll go quiet, because it will be finished. And finished is all I've wanted since I broke that seal. The editor gave her the name before she left, a thing she had not known she needed until he said it. That the Ellery family had once held a homestead north of the capital, and that an old woman of that name still lived at a churchwomen's home for the aged out toward the foothills, a place he knew because the paper had written of its founding years before. It was the first gift of pure luck she had been handed since the mountain, and she took it as a sign that the dead man's long patience had not been for nothing. Night had come down full by the time she found the place, a low, rambling house of whitewashed brick, set among bare cottonwoods at the edge of town, warm light in its windows and wood smoke on the air. And she stood at its gate a moment gathering herself, aware suddenly of the soot, still under her nails, the borrowed dress, the bound and battered hands, the wildness that 3 days of flight had worked into her. A kind-faced matron answered her knock and looked her over with the frank appraising eye of a woman who ran a house on little money. And when Adelia asked for Marguerite Ellery, the appraisal softened into something careful. She's very old, and her heart is not strong, and she has few enough visitors these days. The matron did not move from the doorway. Who is it that's come so late to see her, and looking as though she rode through weather to do it? Someone who carries a message she has waited a long time for. Adelia held the woman's gaze. Longer than either of us has been alive to count. I mean her no harm. I mean her the opposite of harm. But it can't wait for a decent hour, because there are men who'd stop it reaching her if they could. And I've come a hard way to see that they don't. Something in the plainness of it moved the matron to step back and let her in. And she led Adelia down a warm, dim hall, smelling of beeswax and old wood smoke, to a room at its end, where a single lamp burned low and an old woman sat wrapped in shawls by a banked fire, her hands folded in her lap, her white head tipped toward the window as if she were listening for something in the dark beyond it. She turned as the door opened, and her eyes, when they found Adelia's face, were the sharp, undimmed blue of a mind that had outlasted the body carrying it. You're not one of the sisters. The old voice was thin but steady. And you're not anyone I know. Yet you've come into my room at an hour when the sisters are asleep, wearing a face I've never seen, and looking at me as if you knew me. So you had best tell me quickly who you are, before I decide whether to be frightened. Adelia crossed the small room and knelt by the old woman's chair, bringing herself down to the level of those searching eyes, and she drew the letter from her satchel with hands that had begun to tremble in a way the cold had never made them. My name is Adelia Voss, and I'm no one to you, and I have carried something a very long way to put into your hands. She held up the folded pages so the lamplight fell across the 3 words scored into their face. I found it 4 days ago, in a cabin high up in the Sawtooth country, hidden where no one was meant to find it for 100 years. It was written for you. It has been waiting for you since before I was born. The old woman's eyes dropped to the letter, and Adelia watched the sharp blue gaze catch on the looping ink of her own name. Watched the breath go out of her in a long, unsteady rush, watched one frail hand rise from the shawls and hover over the pages without quite daring to touch them, as though they might dissolve if she reached too fast. That hand. The words came out cracked and small. I would know that hand across 100 years. I have known it in my sleep every night of my life. Where? Her voice failed her, and she tried again, her fingers still trembling above the paper. Where did you say you found it? Where has it been? In the mountains north of here. Adelia kept her voice gentle, laying the letter softly into the old woman's open hands, closing the frail fingers over it. He hid it there to keep it safe. He hid a great many things there, and I'll tell you all of it. Everything, as much as you want to hear. But the letter first. He wrote it for your eyes, not mine. I only carried it home. Marguerite Ellery held the pages against her chest a long moment. With her eyes closed, and when she opened them and unfolded the brittle paper and began to read, the years seemed to fall away from her face one by one, until Adelia could see, beneath the deep lines and the pale papery skin, the young woman who had once stood under a summer tree and made a promise. She read slowly, her lips moving over the words, one hand pressed flat to her mouth. And when she reached the lines that spoke of the cold, and the 2 days running, and the name carried up the mountain like a coal cupped against the wind, a sound broke from her that was not quite a sob, and not quite a laugh. The sound of a grief held for 24 years, finally given leave to move. They told me he ran off. Her voice shook, but it did not stop. That is what they said all those years ago. That Elias Thorncroft was a thief and a coward who robbed the county and fled north and left me to answer for it. My own father believed them. I half believed them, Snubblelf, in the black hours, because he never came, and a woman can only wait so long against silence before the silence starts to sound like an answer. Her fingers tightened on the pages, and all this time he was lying up there in the cold, having written me this, having loved me right to the end of it, and I let myself doubt him. I let them make me doubt him. He never doubted you. Adelia covered the old woman's shaking hands with her own bruised ones. The last thing he did with his freedom was write you proof of it and hide it where the men who lied about him could never reach it and trust that someday someone would carry it down. He built his own faith into that box against every chance the world would break it. He lost everything he had, and he made sure the one thing that outlived him would be the truth of how he loved you. There isn't a fortune in those mountains worth what he left in that letter. The old woman wept then, quietly, without shame, the slow, spare tears of the very old. And Adelia knelt beside her and held her hands and let her weep, asking nothing, filling no silence, until the worst of it had passed and Marguerite drew a long, steadying breath and lifted her head. You said there were other things. In the box. You said you would tell me, so Adelia told her. She told her of the gold and the old red-sealed notes, of the journal in the sheriff's own hand, of Josiah Harker and the forged foreclosures and the decade of quiet theft that had raised the greatest fortunes in the territory out of the ruin of families like the Thorncrofts. She told her that the Harkers had never stopped hunting the box, that they had lied her, Elias, into a thief to cover the man they truly were, and that even now, 24 years on, a grandson of that same sheriff stood 3 weeks from the governor's chair. His campaign paid for out of the stolen ground. She told her, last of all, that the truth was at that very hour being set into type in a newspaper office across the city, that by morning it would be on the streets of the capital in 10,000 copies, and that no strong room and no marshal and no fortune could gather it back once the presses ran. Marguerite listened to all of it with her sharp blue eyes fixed on Adelia's face. And when it was done, she sat very still for a while, the letter still clutched in her lap. And then she said a thing that Adelia would carry with her for the rest of her life. A wicked man builds himself a monument and calls it a family, and thinks the years will make it holy. But the truth is patient. The truth will sit in the cold and the dark for a lifetime if it has to, and wait for one brave soul to come along and pick it up. Her fingers tightened on the letter. You picked it up. You could have left it in that box and saved yourself the whole terrible road, and no one would ever have known to blame you. But you picked it up and you carried it down. That is not a small thing. That is very nearly the largest thing a person can do. They talked long into the night, the old woman and the young, while the fire burned low and the sisters slept, and it was near dawn when the matron knocked softly and told them that a boy had come to the door from the newspaper office with word for the visitor. Adelia went out to him, and the boy, breathless and pleased with his errand, told her that the presses had run all night, that the whole front page carried the story of the Harker theft and the murdered heir, and the woman who had brought the proof down out of the mountains, that copies were already going up and down every street in the capital and out along every rail line by the morning trains, and that the editor said to tell her it was done. It was truly done. It was too far into the world now for any man alive to call it back. She stood in the cold gray doorway with the boy's words settling over her, and she understood that she had won, that the long flight was over, that the thing Elias Thorncroft had hidden up a chimney 24 winters before had at last done the work he made it for. But she understood, too, that winning was not the same as safety, that the Harker power was wounded now, and a wounded power is most dangerous of all, and that there would be a reckoning still to come, in courtrooms and hearing rooms, with marshals and lawyers and men who did not forgive. She was not afraid of it. She had been afraid on the mountain, and afraid in the yard at Camas Junction, and afraid in the eating house at Sawtell with the clean-booted men working the tables. But the fear had all burned out of her somewhere on the cold road, and what was left in its place was something harder and quieter and not to be moved. The days that followed proved her right on every count. The story, once loose, could not be contained, and it did what stories do when they are true, and the time is right for them. It spread from the capital's papers to the papers of every town in the territory, and then to the great papers back east, where a governor's race brought low by a 50-year secret made the kind of headline that sold out 3 printings. The federal court that Adelia had feared might be owned found that it could not afford to be, not with the whole nation reading. And a prosecutor she had never met took up the journal as though it were a live coal, and built from it the case that a dozen frightened territorial officials had spent a generation refusing to build. Old land seizures were reopened. Old forged deeds were pulled from the county records and held up to the light. And Cornelius Harker, 3 weeks from the governorship, found the ground of his family's fortune dissolving beneath him faster than his lawyers could shore it up. He was arrested on a cold, bright morning at a campaign gathering in the capital, before a crowd that had come to cheer him and stayed to watch him take an aide away. And Adelia was not there to see it, but she read of it, as the whole territory read of it, and she thought as she folded the paper that the dead man's long patience had finally been paid out in full. The gold and the old notes went where such things go, when the law takes an interest into evidence and then into the slow machinery of restitution. And in time a portion of it found its way back to the families whose ruin the journal had documented. The freighters among them, 80 acres of bottomland restored to a man who had hauled a stranger 100 miles and asked nothing for it. Adelia saw to it that his name reached the prosecutor. She saw to it that a good many names reached the prosecutor, for she had read the journal cover to cover on the cold road, and she had forgotten none of them. But the thing she cared for most had nothing to do with courts or restitution or the fall of a great house. It was this, that Marguerite Ellery lived to see her Elias cleared. The old woman's health, which had been failing when Adelia first knelt by her chair, seemed to steady and even rally in the weeks that followed, as if the settling of a lifelong grief had given her something to stay for. And she lived to read in the papers that the man they had called a thief was named at last for what he truly was, a wronged and honest man who had died trying to right a great injustice. She lived to see his name restored, and to have the letter read aloud in a courtroom as evidence, his last words to her, carrying across the very territory that had slandered him. And there was not a dry eye in the gallery when the clerk finished reading, and the old woman in the front row pressed a handkerchief to her mouth and nodded, once as though answering a question that had been put to her a quarter of a century before. Adelia stayed near her through all of it. She had gone up the mountain a solitary woman who kept to her sketches and her surveys and asked little of anyone. And she came down from it bound by a promise to a stranger. And the promise had grown, in the keeping of it, into something she had not expected and did not want to give up. She took a small set of rooms in the capital. She went back to her illustrating, for the railroad still wanted its slopes and grades rendered in a way that made investors believe, and she found the work waiting for her, and no shortage of it. But she spent her Sundays out at the whitewashed house among the cottonwoods, sitting with the old woman by the fire, and the two of them talked of everything and nothing, and a friendship grew between them that neither had gone looking for, and both came to lean upon. It was on one of those Sundays, in the first true warmth of the following spring, that Marguerite told her what she meant to do with the portion of the restored fortune that the court had found was rightly hers. Uh, as the woman Elias Thorncroft had named in his own hand as the one he meant to marry. She had no children and no family left living, and more money now than a woman of her years could ever spend. And she had thought long about what such a windfall was for. There is a home in this town for children who have lost their people, she said, the ones the fever left behind, and the ones whose fathers went into the mines and did not come out, and the ones simply left on a church step by someone who could not keep them. I visited it once, years ago, and I never forgot the look of those small faces. I mean to see they never want for a warm bed or a full plate or a teacher to raise them up. Her sharp blue eyes found Adelia's. Elias and I meant to build a life and fill a house, and the world took that from us. But there is more than one way to fill a house. A fortune raised up out of stolen homes ought to go to making homes, don't you think, for the ones who have none. And so it was done. And it was Adelia who helped her do it. The two of them driving out together through the spring mud to the crowded orphan home at the edge of town, where the money that had ruined so many families across a generation was turned at last to the mending of the smallest and least of them. New rooms were raised where the old ones had been overcrowded. Warm coats were laid in against the next winter, and books, and a proper stove for the schoolroom, and a garden was dug in the yard where the children could plant and tend, and watch things grow. Adelia sketched them at their play, the way she had once sketched slopes and cuts and grades, and she found she liked the work of it better than any she had ever done. And the children, who had learned young to be wary of strangers, learned to run to her when her wagon came up the lane. There was one boy among them, a serious, quiet child of perhaps 10, with a cowlick that would not lie down and a way of watching everything, before he trusted any of it, who reminded Adelia, though she could not have said exactly why, of herself at that age, and who reminded Marguerite, she confessed one afternoon with her hand pressed to her heart, of a boy she had known long ago under a summer tree. The two women took to him, and he to them, slowly, in the way of a child who has learned to hope carefully, and by the summer's end it was understood among the three of them and the matron who ran the home that this boy would have a family after all. An old woman and a young one, and a whitewashed house among the cottonwoods where he would always have a warm bed and a full plate, and two people who were glad past speaking that he existed. They named him for no one but himself, at his own solemn insistence, and Adelia sketched him, on the day it became official, standing very straight in a new coat with the old woman's hand on his shoulder, and the spring light coming down through the cottonwoods. And she kept that drawing all her life, longer than she kept any other thing. Years afterward, when she was herself old, and Marguerite long gone to lie at last beside the man whose name she had cleared, Adelia would take out that drawing and the brittle folded letter she had never been able to make herself surrender to any evidence box. And she would think of the cabin in the snow, and the box in the chimney, and the long cold road, and the strange arithmetic by which a woman freezing to death on a mountain had reached up into the dark and pulled down, instead of her own end, the mending of so many lives she would never have touched otherwise. She had gone into those mountains to draw a railroad, and she had come out carrying a dead man's love and a thief's ledger. And she had learned on the road between the two that the world is held together not by the powerful, who take and forge and bury, but by the ordinary souls who pick up what has been dropped and carry it the rest of the way home. A freighter who would not open the crates. An editor who never learned to be wise. A stranger who knelt by an old woman's chair at midnight to keep a promise made by a man dead a quarter of a century. None of them had been obliged to do the thing they did. All of them had done it anyway. And because they had, a wicked house had fallen, and a wronged man had been named at last for what he was, and an old woman had died in peace, and a boy who might have grown up with nothing grew up instead in a house full of light. And none of it, not one single piece of it, would have come to pass had a woman on the edge of surrender not turned her head one final degree and seen a roofline in the snow. That, Adelia would think, was the truest thing the mountain ever taught her, truer than any lesson about cold or courage, or the long patience of buried things. We do not get to choose the moment the world reaches out and asks something of us. We only get to choose what we do when it comes. And she had chosen, half frozen and half ruined and entirely alone, to crawl toward the light instead of away from it. And every good thing that ever after filled her life had come from that one small, stubborn turning of her head.